It's amazing how our eyes can sometimes play tricks on us. Some of you may say that's how you wound up married, but no, but our eyes can play tricks on us, for example, when it comes to judging distances. Like if you have been to the beach and you've gotten on the beach and you see that pier off in the distance and you think, well, it'd be nice to go walk to that pier. 4 hours later you get and then you have to call a family member to come pick you up because you're too tired. Our eyes can play a trick on us so that what appears to be not so far away is actually some miles away. Our eyes can play tricks on us also as well as it relates to roofs and judging angles. So, for example, like looking at the roof of your house or the roof of this building from the ground, it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. Years ago, I had needed to get onto the roof of our previous house to paint a brick up on the chimney that the paint had come off, and I looked up at the roof. Oh, that's not that big of a deal. So I get the ladder out, I got the paint, and I climb up. I get on the roof, and I have gone up, 6 or 7 feet up this angle, and all of a sudden, and I have no explanation for this, but I just got paranoid with fright. I just froze. And all I could think is, what are the neighbors going to be saying when the fire trucks get here in a little bit to get my fat self off the roof, because I am scared to death. It was, and I couldn't explain myself out of it. I was just kind of paralyzed by it. And thankfully, Caroline comes out and she coaxes me enough, or coaches me all over to the ladder, and I was able to get down. And that experience taught me this: don't get on the roof. And so, since that time, I know that getting on a roof is something that scares me. It produces exorbitant fear. And because it scares me, make fun of me if you want, I don't care. You know what I don't do? I don't get on a roof. Why? Because it scares me. Now, there's plenty of things in life that evoke fear in my life or yours, things that may bother me, that may not bother you, or vice versa. But there are things that we know that present themselves to us, and because of the experience of fear that it produces, we tell ourselves going forward, not going to do that. I'm not going to do that because it scares me. I'm not going to do that because that evokes fear. Now, I get that, and certainly it is the case that makes sense as it relates to climbing a roof or messing with electricity, all kinds of things that you can't operate that way with. But understand this: if you are someone that has a personal relationship with Christ and you're seeking to follow God as He guides your path and He leads you to seize opportunities that He presents you, the reality is, time and again, He's going to lead you to do some things. And He's going to put on your heart, and He's going to lay right before you a task that He wants you to do that, I'm just going to be honest with you, is going to scare you. There's going to be all sorts of uncertainty about it. There's going to be all sorts of questions that you have, and all of these feelings of anxiety and apprehension, and you are candidly going to be frightened about doing what God has said. And so you've got some options. You can do like me with the roof and say, well, I'm just not going to do that. If I feel scared, I'm not going to do that. But again, plenty of things that God calls us to are going to evoke fear. So that leads us with the question, what do I do? What should I do when I'm afraid to do what God has called me to? We see the answer that day as we keep plodding along through the life of Gideon and what God has tasked him with. We're going to see very clearly he's afraid of. And while God may not lead you to go toe-to-toe with an enemy army, it is the case that there will be some things, and probably already there are some things that God has put on your heart that fear was part of your response. So what do you do? God doesn't want you to say, well, I'm just scared, I'm just not going to do that. When you view that as not being an option, what should you do? Look with me in your Bibles to Judges chapter 7. Judges chapter 7, and we see in verse 9, we're told, that night the Lord said to Gideon to get up and attack the camp, for I have handed it over to you. But if you're afraid to attack the camp, go down with Purah, your servant. Listen to what they say, and then you'll be encouraged to attack the camp. So he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outpost of the troops who were in the camp. Now the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the Kedemites had settled down in the valley like a swarm of locusts. Their camels were innumerable as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon arrived, there was a man telling his friend about a dream. He said, "Listen, I had this dream. A loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp, struck a tent, and it fell. The loaf turned the tent upside down so that it collapses." And his friend said, "This is nothing less than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has handed the entire Midianite camp over to him." All right, so that's the passage. But what I want you to notice is where God has told Gideon, if you're afraid, ... What God was tasking Gideon with produced fear. What God may task you with produces fear. So what do you do? How is it that we should respond? Well, I think based on what we see here in Gideon's life, and as in this particular example, though the specifics are different, we can still step out, and I think there's some principles that help us think through this. And the first thing that we need to do is this: don't deny the obvious. Do not deny the obvious. Now, so that you've got the story back in your mind, the Israelites had for a long time been ignoring God, acting like all of their pagan neighbors. And so God responds to this through some very adverse circumstances. And the circumstances that he led them to go through was that the Midianites, for a period of 7 years, would come in and they kept over and over and over and over again plundering them and taking any and everything that was of value or consequence that would help them to just get by, to defend themselves. Anything of value, they took it. And finally, after 7 years, they have gotten their attention focused back on God. They asked for God to help, and God's response is to raise up Gideon. This guy who's the youngest in his family, an inconsequential family from what is perhaps the least consequential of the 12 tribes. And he says, "Hey, I want you to be the one to lead this overthrowing of the oppression at the hand of the Midianites." And we've seen time and again how God has confirmed that. And finally, we're on the doorstep of him actually acting. And so it is the night before this is supposed to happen. And God says to him, "Get up," or actually on this night it's supposed to happen. He says, "Get up and attack the camp." He says, "I've handed it over to you. So now is the time to do this." But interestingly, God says, "But if you are afraid to attack the camp, ... Here's what I want you to do, but if you're afraid of that, ... Out of the gate, one of the things that we need to make very plain is this: God was not uncertain about what Gideon's feelings were. He was not saying, "if you're afraid," as if he didn't know. Never, ever forget that God never loses sight of who and what he's dealing with as he uses a Gideon, as he uses a me, as he uses a you. He always knows what is going on. And so he knew with Gideon was afraid. But honestly, that makes sense, doesn't it? You remember, he and his people, they were outnumbered to begin with 135,000 to 30,000, which became 10,000. Which became 300. So now it's 300 versus 135,000. It makes sense that Gideon's afraid. And God's saying, "Okay, now it's time now to act. But if you're afraid," well, duh. Well, what do you want me to do? He says, "Take your servant and go down to the camp and listen to what they say." Now, it's interesting what God tells him to do. And one of the things that I want you to, and we have to keep this in mind when we're looking at the life of Gideon, what God did for Gideon should not be always a specific expectation that you have. So, for example, this week, if you're thinking, "I don't know what I should do. Should I take this job opportunity or that opportunity?" And so I'm going to go to Hobby Lobby tomorrow and get some sort of fabric, and I'm going to pray for it to be wet one day and dry the next. I'm going to play my own fleece game. And so I expect, because God did that for Gideon, he's going to do that for me. And God said to get right up close to the enemy camp and listen, and maybe God's going to do that for me. If I'm afraid, these are exactly the things that God's going to do. Let me just say that's not the case. Do not use Gideon's example as a point-for-point direct parallel, that God's going to do exactly the same thing that he did for Gideon as he's going to do for you. What I will say is this. In principle, I believe that what God did for Gideon, in principle, he will do for us. God was looking at Gideon, this guy that is needing desperately and wanting desperately for God to confirm in his heart the decision that he should make. God will confirm in your heart. If you're seeking his will, if you're seeking to know what he wants you to do, I believe that he will confirm that. And I believe if you are afraid, and God knows that, there are ways in which he's going to respond. So the specific way he responds may be different, but I think the general principle is the same. And as you experience this, I believe what you need to do is, first of all, again, don't deny the obvious. Pay attention to what God does. He tells Gideon, listen, if you are afraid, go down to the Midianite camp. Just you and your servant. Keep in mind, they're going down to where 135,000 enemy troops are. You think you'd want to do that? I know I wouldn't want to do that. But God tells him to go down there, and we'll see, and you see it in the passage, though, how overwhelming what he sees actually is. I mean, there's 135,000 people. There's all of these they're like locusts. There are more camels, it seems, than there are grains of sand on the shore. And he gets to see this up close and personal. Isn't that interesting? He says, if you're afraid, go do this. And what he tells him to do, if you step back, isn't it kind of highlighting why he should have been afraid? You think about it. Okay, God, I'm scared. All right, go down and look up close and personal at the enemy. See how numerous they are. See how expansive their forces are. See how well armed, up close and personal they are. See how many camels they have. See what it looks like to have a sea of enemy soldiers numbering 135,000, knowing it's you and 299 others against all of that. It's interesting. What I would say to you is to pay attention to what God does not do here. You say, well, what is it that God is not doing? This is how I would explain that. Much to Caroline's dislike, I have been in the delivery room for all 6 of our children being born. And especially after Nathan was born, I think I was always on borrowed time as to whether or not she would let me in for the birth of the other kids. But let me just be honest with you and say I'm not the person you really want in that room with you. Let me say this also. I write out a full manuscript for a sermon, and when I wrote that sentence, I have been in the delivery room for the birth of all. I actually typed 7. You're talking about fear. Anyway, but I have been in the labor and delivery room for all of our children being born. And as I said, and this may come as a surprise to you, but in truth, I'm not the guy you really want in the labor and delivery room with you. Now, I remember what it was like when Caroline was pregnant with Nathan, because they got all these prenatal, pre-parenting classes that they want mom and dad to go through to help you be prepared for everything that's going to be going on. And you get to tour the hospital and to see all this stuff that you're going to actually experience once this child comes, or as this child comes into the world. And so we had that, and we had all this instruction. And one of the things that they had talked about is they're telling the father things that you can do while the mother is giving birth. You know, encourage her and say all these things to help her as she's bringing this child into the world. And so I knew all of that. I had been exposed to all of that. And yet, as it comes time for these children actually to come into the world, like I've got a nurse or nurses that are in there, and they're saying things like, boy, you've got this. You can do it. You're almost there. Just a little bit. You're almost there. You're doing so good. You've got this. You can do this. And I'm saying things like, I bet that hurts. I don't know what's wrong with me. I know something is. And I know I should be saying all those other things, but this is the stuff that I'm saying. And the reason they want you to say those types of things, the reason that Caroline wishes that I was not in the room, is because a lot of times we like to operate that way so that there is some sort of challenge that you are experiencing, and it really feels good to have somebody that's a cheerleader saying, you've got this, you are enough, you can do this just a little bit more, you are so strong, you've got this, you can do this. And boy, that feels good, doesn't it? In fact, there is a phrase that we use to describe what we are doing as that is being experienced. We describe it as being psyched out or psyching ourselves out, right? And what's going on as that occurs is that we are seeking to distract from the reality of the challenge, to minimize the challenge and to maximize my ability. So if I want to psych myself out and say, Michael, you can get on that roof, you can do this. What I'm trying to do is to minimize the challenge and to maximize my ability. Let me just tell you, as God tasks me, as He tasks you, as He presents opportunities that may evoke fear, one of the ways that God will never, ever, ever, ever work in my life or in yours is to psych me out such that it minimizes the challenges and maximizes my ability. God doesn't do that at all for Gideon. In fact, if anything, what God does is to maximize the obstacle. He puts Gideon on a front row to this, seeing 135,000 soldiers, knowing all he's got is 300. Seeing all of these camels and guys that can get on these camels, and the only thing worse than an armed soldier is a mounted soldier. And so this makes it even worse. God wasn't psyching Gideon out. As the Lord puts things on your heart, as He places a burden about things that He wants you to be involved in, it may very well be that the rational, reasonable response is some fear. And as you experience that, God doesn't want you to say, and I don't think God wants you to play some sort of game where, oh no, I've got this, I can do this. I need to just stand up straight and walk headfirst into this. Don't deny the reality. God was not seeking to lead Gideon to think, oh, it's not that big of a deal. You can do this. You've got this. He doesn't do that. He puts him up close and personal with how big the challenge is. As you experience fear, do not deny the obvious. Don't play a game. Don't try to psych yourself out, because that's a game. All right, so if I don't do that, what else should I do? Well, based on what we see here, I believe the second thing we should do is this: pay attention to God's consistency. Pay attention to God's consistency. All right, so Gideon gets down with Purah. They sneak up to the camp. And the Midianites, they've got friends. The Amalekites, the Kedemites, they're there. And it's like there's a swarm of locusts. There are so many people. You ever stepped on an anthill and it's just pouring? I mean, this is what it looks like. There's just so many people. Their camels were as innumerable as the sand on the seashore. And when Gideon comes up, it's at an outpost, it seems, and he hears one of these soldiers telling his compadre about a dream that he had. And the dream was kind of unusual. You ever have an unusual dream? Probably. Well, we've all had dreams. And when I mean unusual dream, I mean like, huh? I mean something just obscenely bizarre. Yeah, so like this zebra came over for lunch, and we, I don't know, we ate pumpkin pies and then, went skeet shooting. What? I mean, just something bizarre. The dream that is described here is about that bizarre. So you got two soldiers, these enemies, that Gideon overhears, one telling the other his dream. He said, man, it's so strange. I had this dream last night, and in this dream, there was like this big loaf of barley bread. Not good, enriched white bread, but, healthy barley bread. And it comes tumbling down into the Midianite camp, and it hits a tent. It's kind of strange, and bread's not that heavy. It's not that big, but this loaf of bread comes tumbling in, hits a tent, knocks it down, flips it over even. It's bizarre. I mean, how many dreams have you had about bread knocking tents down? That's a very bizarre dream. But his compadre hears this and says, this is nothing less than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has handed the entire Midianite camp over to him. Seeing that should prompt probably a few questions. First of all, how did they know who Gideon even was? Remember, he's from a small family, from a nobody tribe. He has no military experience. He has no leadership experience. Why would they? It's a completely random name, it would seem. Why are they talking about him? And it's not just any Gideon, it's Gideon, son of Joash, if there's any question about that. They don't know Gideon, they don't know Joash. How do they know that? And this is the sword of Gideon. How does barley bread equal Israel? And how do the Midianites equal a tent? All of those are reasonable questions. But one of the things that you see is that Gideon, while those questions might have gone through his mind, that's not what he's focusing on. It seems what he focuses on is, oh my goodness, the only way that all of this can be explained is that God has been and is at work, and God is in this. But that is, at this point, in Gideon's mind, nothing new. I mean, that's how it has been from the very beginning. When God, back in chapter 6, sends the angel to confront Gideon, the first thing that he says to Gideon, the first message that Gideon ever hears from God is this. It's back in verse 12 of chapter 6. The Lord is with you. In verse 14 of that chapter, he says, I'm sending you. And then says again in verse 16, I will be with you. So he's saying, I'm in this. I'm with you. I'm tasking you. I'm going to be with you. And then God goes through a series of confirming acts. The first was the consumption of this unleavened bread and meat that was placed on a rock. After that, there was the sign of the fleece where in two different instances, God has confirmed, I am in this. And then what we saw the other week is that God winnowed the size and the scope of Israel's armies. And he says, listen, you've got too many troops for me, that's God, to hand the Midianites over to you. Else Israel would say, my own strength saved me. He's trying to say that I am going to do this. I am in this. And then as you get to this chapter, what does God say in verse 9? He says, get up and attack the camp. I have handed it over to you. What I want you to see is that over and over and over and over again, God was demonstrating to Gideon, I am in this. That which I have called you to, I'm making that clear, and I'm making clear that I am going to be the power supply to all of this. That it doesn't depend on you. In fact, I think as it relates to that first point about not denying the obvious, I think he wanted Gideon to get up close and personal to see just how massive these enemy forces were, just how great they were equipped, just how much Israel was outmatched, so that he would know the only way that this can happen is if God is in this. And finally, what he sees before the assault finally begins is that God has confirmed once again, I'm in this, I'm with you, and you can't do this, but I can. I'm bigger than the obstacle, I'm bigger than the threat, and I'm with you. This was consistency in message. That is important, and by that, it is something in my life and your life that we ought to pay attention to. Let me illustrate it this way. Those of you that have a driver's license, push comes to shove, there are probably some people that you may ride in the car with, but at the end of the day, if pressed, we kind of really think that nobody else can drive except us. Isn't that the case? Like, for example, I don't think Caroline can drive. She doesn't think I can drive, right? It's just how it works. Maybe that's just a gift of marriage. Now, I think that I'm not saying I'm the best driver, but I think of myself as a pretty good driver. That being said, I realize that there are some challenges that I have for which I have really no explanation. Let's say, for example, I come up to a four-way stop. Maybe it's in a neighborhood. Perhaps it's even in a shopping center. Like if you go to the Costco, as you come in, there's that four-way stop there. I don't know what's going on in my head as that happens, but it's like I get nervous. And I know what should happen is that if vehicles approach an intersection at the same time, what happens? The person on the right's supposed to go. So I may know it is my turn, but it's like I get nervous. And strangely, I want to be kind of nice. All right? So I'll motion for somebody else to do that, but here's the problem. I start rolling. So I kind of let off the brake and I motion. And so they're seeing that and they're like, what are you doing? And I've got Caroline with me saying, what are you doing? Because what am I actually doing? I'm giving out mixed messages. I'm saying go, but then I'm rolling saying stop. Well, which is it? Either you want me to go or you don't want me to go. Be consistent in this. I can't tell you how important this is in my life and in yours to pay attention to the consistency of God's confirmation and confirming acts in your life as He burdens you, as He tasks you, as He equips you. And one of the things that God will never do is to give you mixed messages. God doesn't send confusing signals. What He does is to put a burden on your heart. He gives you a task, and then He begins to operate, confirming that and showing, I am in this. And even if the task is great and the obstacle seems to be insurmountable, He's going to keep confirming that. Keep confirming that. Pay attention to the consistency. And finally, having seen all of this consistency, Gideon is ready to act, even though he was afraid. Stacks of stuff are going to evoke fear in our life. It could be heights, it could be spiders, it could be tests, it could be major life decisions. Gobs of things are going to evoke fear. Some of those are things that just occur in life. But some of those are things that God, as one of His followers, He puts on you, that He tasks you, and He says, I want you to do this. This is the opportunity, this is the door that I want you to go through. And you're going to be scared. And you've got a couple of options. One is to say, not going to do it. That's how I am with a roof. I'm scared. I'm just not going to do that anymore. Gideon could have said, not going to do it. And I'm telling you, we wouldn't be talking about Gideon today. Perhaps it is that what God has been doing in your heart and your life, maybe over the past numbers of weeks, as we've been talking about Gideon, increasingly what you're seeing is less of Gideon and more of yourself in this story. And you know that God is tasking you with something, and I can't begin to tell you what that is, but you know it. And it's scary. It's frightening. Listen, don't play a game of psyching yourself out. God doesn't want you to deny the obvious. Oh, no, it's no big deal. In fact, if anything, God is going to lead you to see just how great the obstacle is. But He's going to operate in ways that confirm He is in this. And when God's in it, it doesn't make any difference how high the mountain is. Will you bow your heads with me?